So welcome everyone to today's symposium. It's my pleasure to be the moderator. We have a number of excellent speakers on covering a range of exciting topics in this area. So our first speaker is Dr. Phil Fisher, who is professor of psychology at the University of Oregon and also science director for the National Forum on Early Childhood Policy and Programs at Harvard University. And Dr. Fisher will be telling us about his work on recovery from early life stress. Dr. Fisher?
Well, good morning, and thanks for the invitation. It's actually a number of years ago, before everybody was moving to Portland after college, people moved to Cambridge after college, and so I spent a year here after college myself, and it's a pleasure to be back. I do want to start by acknowledging the various institutions where this work has been supported. This includes the University of Oregon and also the Oregon Social Learning Center in Eugene, as well as at the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. And you'll be hearing a number of themes throughout the day, I believe, that emanate from the Harvard Center. So the focus of my talk, I know there's a broad range of areas that are going to be covered today. I'm going to specifically be talking about our research involving children who have experienced high levels of adversity and are in the foster care system, the child welfare system in the United States, and how we can learn from that population about how the effects of early adversity can be addressed, can be overcome, but also what we can learn from working with that population about the effects of early adversity. So it's really kind of a reciprocal kind of knowledge base. And in order to frame my talk, I just want to briefly touch on kind of the way in which the field has evolved. So historically, a great deal of research in child development really was fairly descriptive in nature and involved correlational designs. Oftentimes, in terms of early adversity, involved looking at people's retrospective self-reports and cross-sectional studies, and really just simply plotted the connection between experiences that people have and outcomes. And although that began to give us an idea about the importance of adverse experiences and their impact on outcomes, there's really limitations of this work, obviously. More recently, starting in the 1960s and 70s, people began to conduct longitudinal research studies to look at how development occurs in the family over time. And one of the things that these studies did was really allow us to begin to shift from correlational models, where we were just looking at how events are associated with later outcomes, to more kinds of causal models. And in particular, one of the areas that became an emphasis of a lot of work in the context of this, some of this emanated from the work of Jerry Patterson and colleagues at my institute in Oregon, but many others as well, was the central role that parenting or caregiving plays on impacting outcomes. That is to say that although many variables had been found both at the individual and at much broader levels to impact outcomes, the impact of these outcomes was seen in many studies as being particularly impactful to the extent that they had an effect on the parenting relationship. It was when the parenting became disrupted by these experiences that we saw the development of a variety of problems in children downstream. One of the things about these models that began to develop that looked at mediators, so-called mediators of outcomes, things like parenting, is that to the extent that the mediators, these processes that other experiences seem to flow through, the extent to which they were malleable, they could be changed in the context of intervention work, meant that there was potential to really begin to impact these outcomes that we wanted to address by impacting the specific mediators. And in fact, one of the things that led to, as these theories began to unfold, was the idea that randomized intervention trials weren't just efforts to test programs and see if they worked, but that they could actually serve as tests, experimental tests of these conceptual or theoretical models. That is, to the extent that an intervention was designed to impact some of these malleable processes, such as parenting, and to the extent that they were effective at doing so, and by doing so, that we then affected downstream outcomes, such as child behavior problems, attentional problems, delinquency, then that could serve potentially not only as proof that the intervention was useful, but also as support for the underlying theory of the centrality of parenting as a key predictive process in outcomes. And indeed, over time, many parenting-focused interventions have been developed, not only at our institute, but obviously in many other places that have followed this model of using randomized clinical trials to evaluate the extent to which impacting parenting is then going to have an effect on outcomes. And there's a large literature on these interventions and how they work and the extent to which they really do make a difference. But I'll talk more about some of their limitations as well later on in my talk. Now, this same approach that was developed for just the basic kind of models of parenting as a central process in predicting outcomes can also be applied to understanding the effects of early life stress. That is, the specification of intermediate or mediating variables in the causal process leading to specific outcomes are things that we as well have the ability to study. And one way to think about this is to ask sort of which specific stress-sensitive neurobiological systems are affected by specific kinds of early experiences. And in what way are those relationships mediated through subsequent processes that might occur in the child's life, including parenting, but other relationships as well, to affect specific outcomes? So this kind of conceptual model, which is just an extension of the kind of work on parenting, really allows us to begin to look at the moving parts rather than just looking at the end product of negative experiences. We can begin to understand what some of the processes are that allow things to unfold in this way. And similarly, just as we were talking about interventions in the context of parenting, interventions that target these same kinds of mediating processes, but then ultimately might affect some of the underlying neurobiological systems to affect outcomes, begin then to serve the foundation of proof of these kinds of theories and conceptual models about the centrality not only of the interactional processes in families, but also of the impact of the underlying stress systems in predicting outcomes. So within our own work, and I'll start to fill in some content now because this has all been theoretical, within children in the foster care system, the particular model that we've been focusing on emphasizes the extent to which maltreatment experiences and subsequent experiences when children in foster care have an impact on particular underlying neuroregulatory systems, including the HPA axis, the areas of the prefrontal cortex involved in executive functioning, threat response systems, and so forth, as mediated through experiences that children have in their caregiving environments subsequent to the maltreatment. And that it's that pathway, that mediated pathway of connecting early experiences to outcomes mediated through the subsequent family experiences that children have to predict outcomes that really forms the core of our conceptual model, but also that because of this quality that the caregiving environment has of being malleable and responsive to interventions, that we have the ability to be impactful in that area and then subsequently affect outcomes. So again, this serves not only as tests of underlying models about how to impact outcomes, but also helps us validate theories about the centrality of the underlying neural systems. So as I said at the beginning, really this work can be seen as having a reciprocal influence on both policy and on scientific understanding. We can develop more effective programs using this kind of a framework and this kind of a model, but we also, in the process, increase our understanding of not only the effects of early life stress, but the potential reversibility of those effects or recovery from early adversity for individuals who've experienced these kinds of things. So how does this apply to foster care? Just a brief thumbnail sketch of foster care. So there are over 500,000 children in the United States who are in out-of-home care. there due to maltreatment, most frequently actually due to neglect, although there are also experiences of physical and sexual abuse and emotional neglect in this population. Research has consistently shown, epidemiological surveys, that these children lag behind on just about any health or mental health indicator. But the other thing about this, especially germane to today's symposium, is that like other contexts such as international adoption, institutional settings in developing countries, foster care really provides an excellent context for understanding the effects of early adversity on the developing brain and the potential to recover from it. Now, it's not necessarily an easy context in which to do this kind of research. There are a lot of challenges, but it really does afford us an opportunity to see what's happened to children who may have had the kinds of early experiences that we believe are really likely to lead to deficiencies or to alterations in these systems, and what can be done. Our work began a long time ago with some of those basic kind of descriptive studies that I alluded to at the beginning of my talk, where all we were really doing was comparing foster children to low-income community children on many indicators. One of the things that was at least a specific focus of this research that we were very careful about was that we didn't want to compare foster children to middle and upper income children. So these were children from the same communities, but who had been maltreated and placed in foster care. And like the other work, what this work really served to do is validate the idea that, again, children who come from backgrounds with high levels of disadvantage and adversity do appear to lag behind on most indicators that we looked at. So these are cognitive and language measures, and you can just very quickly see that the foster children are looking, they're just always the lower bars on the chart. Similarly, in terms of children's emotional development, their emotion understanding measures, their ability to correctly identify emotions in facial photographs lag behind that of community children. And I'm sure we'll hear more about this over the course of today, the children not only experienced cognitive and emotional delays, but also physical growth delays. So these children were of shorter stature, had smaller head circumferences than the community children. So beyond just the descriptive work, we then began to map out what systems might be affected in these children that might begin to form part of our model. And in particular, we've looked initially in most of our work at two domains, the HPA axis and the prefrontal areas of the prefrontal cortex involved in executive functioning. Now, as many of you know, and many people here know much more about this than I do, there are many animal models of adverse early experience, including work by this man, Gig Levine, who mentored a number of us in this field, showing that adverse rearing conditions produce not just short-term and transitory, but really long-term prolonged effects on the organism, both at a behavioral and at a neural level. A lot of the work that Gig did and that many of us have done subsequently has focused in terms of early adversity on the development of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the system that produces cortisol. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the physiology of the HPA axis, but it's a system that helps to maintain homeostatic balance in response to real or perceived stressors through the production of cortisol, which helps to metabolize energy and stimulate the immune system and so forth. Studies of rodents and primates exposed to adverse rearing conditions show alterations in the physiology of the HPA axis. And one of the things that has consistently been found, and here's an animal model by Mar Sanchez, is that these conditions produce not only effects on the production of cortisol in response to stressors, but also on the diurnal patterns of productivity of cortisol. So the HPA axis shows a typical daily response that involves high levels around right after 30 minutes after awakening that decrease rapidly throughout the day. And animals reared in stressful conditions will actually, instead of showing high cortisol levels consistently, show a blunting of their diurnal cortisol levels as indicated here. This is germane to the work that we did with maltreated children because we looked specifically at the diurnal patterns of activity in these children. And we noted that unlike many other populations where chronic stress seemed to produce chronically elevated cortisol levels across the day. This is wake up, mid-morning, and evening. Children that we were studying, if they showed dysregulated pattern, showed low levels in the morning. They did not show the typical morning peak, and those levels tended to remain low throughout the day. This was intriguing to us for a number of reasons. First of all, this pattern was observed in internationally adopted children who were initially reared in severely neglectful contexts. In addition, when we began to study this, we were working in partnership, but separately, with Mary Dozier, who was collecting data in Delaware on a similar foster care sample, and she found the exact same thing. When children in foster care showed dysregulated cortisol levels in terms of their diurnal activity, they did not show chronically activated or elevated levels. They showed this blunted pattern that involved low morning cortisol levels. So this is where scientists, as you all know, begin to get excited. When you find something and it doesn't quite fit, maybe it's an error, maybe you don't know exactly what it means, but when you consistently find this pattern in different populations of the same individuals or in individuals from similar contexts, the internationally adopted children, it begins to be the possibility anyway that there's signal and not just noise in what you're picking up. So this low morning cortisol or flattened diurnal rhythm was one characteristic pattern we were seeing in the children. The other thing that we began to do, and this work has been less far along, but we began to look at activation of regions of the prefrontal cortex in the context of laboratory tasks that tapped those particular systems. And we've done this both in terms of behavioral tasks, and we've done a little bit of neuroimaging. And I'd like to just show one slide that is from a very small pilot study that we conducted, but that looked at the activation of brain regions in response to a kind of a classic inhibitory control task in which we ask children to push a button every time a number comes on the screen, except if it's the number 9. And so what we were looking at was what areas of the brain light up in the context of situations where a 9 comes on the screen, so no-go trials where you're primed to push the button and it doesn't. And what you see in the small group of community children that we followed, normal controls, was activation in brain regions that are exactly where you'd expect, on the sides and kind of in the front in the prefrontal cortex. In contrast, what we saw in foster children was much more diffuse patterns of activation. There were areas of activation in the same areas, but there was also a lot more diffuse activation. Similar patterns that were reported in a study by Sarah Durston. I don't know if she did it when she was working in your lab for children with attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, although they were much more clever because they used Pokemon cards for their stimuli instead of just numbers. Okay, so the next question is, if we see disruption in these systems, are there specific kinds of patterns of early adverse experience that map on to the disruptions that we're seeing? And indeed, as we began to look at children in foster care, it wasn't generic experiences, it wasn't just simply being there that predicted whether or not they showed these, at least in terms of cortisol, disruptive patterns of diurnal cortisol production. It specifically was neglectful parenting. So we coded their case files, we coded whether they'd been physically abused, sexually abused, neglected, how many times they'd moved, the age at which they came into care, and the only thing that reliably predicted whether they showed this low morning pattern or not was the extent to which they'd been neglected. That's interesting signal, again, more signal because, as I mentioned, many children that were being studied from post-institutional rearing contexts were showing that same pattern. So what's the commonality there? It's neglect. It's the absence of responsive care early on that seems to be what has an impact on the development, at least of the diurnal pattern of HPA axis activity. We think about this in terms of a term that was coined at the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, and I tip my hat to Jack Schoenkoff over there, around the absence of this idea of serve and return, that when serve and return is present, it should be, and it's expected to be present from an evolutionary perspective, things proceed accordingly. But in the absence of serve and return, it's not just that bad things sometimes happen to kids. The absence of expected things can also have a profound effect on the developing child. So the neglect story maps nicely onto the blunted cortisol activity. Interestingly, it's a different set of events that seem to map on to impact on executive functioning. And in particular, at least what we found so far, is that the amount of times children have moved between caregivers, and it has to be different caregivers. It's not just the number of times they've moved, because if they're going back and forth between biological parent and a single foster carer, that's not as viable a predictor. But the number of unique individuals who've taken care of the child seems to be associated with the propensity for children to have a hard time on tasks that tap executive functioning. So in a nutshell, and again, this is a pattern that we found replicated in other studies, we see differential patterns of connection between specific kinds of early adversity. In one case, it has to do with neglect disrupting the HPA system. In the other case, it's how many caregivers the child has had that seems to be impacting executive functioning, that we begin to be able to map onto alterations in these key underlying neural systems. Back to the intervention story, the question then becomes, well, can we, by effectively targeting these caregiving systems, have an impact on these downstream effects that we've been seeing, both in terms of the neurobiology and in terms of the subsequent outcomes? And so that's been a tremendously important area for our work over time. We've developed a number of interventions to test this, and I won't have time today to get into the details about all of them and how they've evolved. But the original kind of proto-intervention that we developed is something called multidimensional treatment foster care. It's a multi-component intervention that has a number of different emphases to it. It's designed to be implemented in real-world community settings with foster parents. A big component of what we do involves providing support to foster carers using the parenting techniques that, if you refer back to that original slide, the things that seem to be most predictive of positive outcomes in this population. In the context of a number of randomized clinical trials, this is just a design of one where we've compared children who are randomly assigned in foster care to either receive the intervention or be in a services as usual condition. And also, we've always mapped onto a community comparison sample of comparable low-income children from the same communities. We've looked at the impact on a variety of outcomes, including both biological measures and some of these behavioral measures. The particular areas in which we found some of the most exciting results have to do with how parenting impacts the underlying neural systems. So this is a slide that we developed early on that came from a sort of beginning of understanding what might be going on. And what we saw was that amongst children in the foster care samples who showed this low morning pattern when they came in that stayed low throughout the day, over the course of time that the children were receiving the intervention, we began to see the emergence of a typical diurnal pattern, and that was concordant with decreases in disruptive behavior problems that we saw in the same samples. Very exciting. We thought, wow, this is something that seems to really be impacting this underlying biological system, and there seems to be a connection to what we're seeing in behavior. And indeed, when we looked overall at the children in our sample compared to children in regular foster care who started out with low morning cortisol levels, those with those low levels who are in the intervention group showed significant increases at 8 to 9 months post-entry into the study. But the plot thickens here because, and this is something that's often overlooked and really a critical component of our work, not all children in foster care show this pattern. In fact, although about 3 times as many, about 30% of foster children sampled at any particular time will show the pattern, that means that 70% are not. Now, 30% of foster children is 3 times, because in the general population you see this blunted pattern about 10% of the time. So it's considerably more prevalent, but if you look at the overall samples, then you don't see this pattern in enough children that it really affects the overall numbers that you see. And so actually, when we looked at the entire samples, the story that unfolded was one in which regular foster care children as a group showed a propensity to lose their diurnal cortisol patterns across time. That is, they began to show a decrease. These are just morning values plotted over months. And their morning values dipped dramatically over time. Whereas children in the intervention condition and in the community sample, as a group, seemed to maintain their morning levels. So again, confusing story, but one that seems to suggest that overall what may be happening in children in this population is that the system has a lot of lability to it, and that it's under conditions of stress that we see the loss of this diurnal pattern. And in fact, there's some evidence of that from some follow-up analyses that we did, where we found that caregiver stress levels, the amount that foster parents reported experiencing stress in response to children's behavior in regular foster care, stayed high across time, and that in regular foster care, that those high levels of stress were concordant with the lower levels of cortisol in the morning. Interestingly, in the context of this therapeutic foster care where the foster parents had a lot of support and buffering, even though, well, first of all, the levels of stress reported by caregivers decreased over time, and even when levels were high on a given occasion, those were not associated with changes in children's cortisol levels. So it appears that it becomes possible to buffer children from the effects of caregiver stress, but only if the caregivers are in the context of this kind of a supportive therapeutic kind of intervention. So that's sort of the cortisol story. We've seen similar effects around plasticity in terms of executive functioning measures, and specifically, this was a collaboration with Nathan Fox. We looked at how children responded on a computer task, and we were measuring electrical activity on the surface of the scalp using event-related potentials. In the context of a computer task called a flanker task. In this task, children are asked to push a button that is the same color as the button that, as the circle that appears above the white dot here. And you can see that there are instances where the circles are all the same color, and then there are these incongruent trials where the circle is surrounded by circles of different colors. These are more difficult to do. We gave the children feedback in terms of either a smiley face or a frowny face, depending on whether they got the response correct or incorrect. And we looked at a particular component of the event-related potential that's somewhat late occurring called feedback-related negativity. When you can see it occurs in this window, approximately 300 to 600 milliseconds after the feedback is presented. What you can see is when given feedback that children that they've made a mistake, you see an increase in the amount of electrical activity. This is particularly in the electrodes that were placed in the front and center of the child's scalp, over above when they made correct responses. This is a typical pattern that has been seen in response to both error and feedback. And indeed, we saw this consistently in the community children that we followed. However, in children in regular foster care that you can see at the bottom of the screen, there was no difference in their brain response, whether they were making correct responses or incorrect responses and getting that feedback. So there was an insensitivity to the feedback that they were getting. One of the things that we saw that was quite nice was in the context of our intervention, children who had not shown this response originally, who looked like this, began to show a much more healthy response to feedback when they made mistakes. And we've seen this now several times, including in the context of a randomized trial, where children in the intervention condition show a nice response to corrective feedback after they've been in the intervention over time. So plasticity in both HPA system and in at least some of these regions of the prefrontal cortex that seem to be active in response to receiving feedback. I want to be clear, however, and I think this is sort of the crux of my talk and how I'll use the remainder of my time, that even though we've developed this model, this conceptual model, and have been testing it, and we have some evidence to support it, that the evidence is stronger in some areas than others. So in particular, we find, as has been found consistently, that maltreatment seems to have pervasive effects, specific kinds of maltreatment, both on these underlying neural systems and on the downstream effects in terms of behavioral problems and disorders that we might see subsequently. We also see that the intervention in general seems to have main effects both on the underlying systems and on the subsequent outcomes, and those are all very promising. A little bit less clear, and remember I mentioned this is a very kind of comprehensive intervention that has a lot of components. So even though we can say the children are receiving these kinds of caregiving responses, they're getting a lot of other stuff too. So the extent to which we can specifically link the intervention to these specific kinds of behaviors is not as clear. Also, because we haven't clearly specified that this is the only thing that children are receiving, the connections between this and these subsequent outcomes that we found are less well established. But perhaps the least well established at this point, and this has been very elusive, not just for us, but for other people who have been doing this work in the field, has been to show that changes in these underlying systems actually mediate the subsequent outcomes that we're seeing in high-risk children. And so that's an area that really still needs more work. The challenge of work in this area is that even though we have the potential to develop these programs in the context of the real world and to begin to measure these things, we typically do have very comprehensive programs, and it becomes difficult in the context of those programs to have the level of specificity and precision necessary that, for instance, those of you who are animal researchers would employ in doing experimental studies. And so our ability to really clearly delineate the extent to which specific interventions are impacting these underlying systems and therefore impacting downstream outcomes is more limited. In addition, and this came out through some of the data that I've presented, it's also clear that interventions that we've developed, even though we are very excited and they're meaningful when they impact areas of development that we think are important, we also know very clearly that our programs do not impact all individuals, that this is not, just because we say this is an evidence-based approach, doesn't mean that it's necessarily making differences in everybody's lives. There are clearly some things that need to happen for us to really make more progress in this area. And so I just want to end by saying that I think what's needed in terms of moving forward is for us to begin to shift away from focusing specifically on children, but to really look at more two-generational models and specifically how the same processes that we've seen affected in children are often processes that the adults that are taking care of the children also struggle with, that our ability to impact the underlying systems which we've begun to develop clear evidence of in these high-risk populations in the children have good likelihood that they maintain plasticity over longer periods of time. The windows may get may get smaller, but the potential to impact outcomes remains in place, especially when we're talking about very young parents. So there's a lot of potential to continue to make progress by not just targeting the children, but by targeting the same kinds of processes in adults. The other thing is that we need to become much more precise and specific in the interventions that we develop. Although I think it's permissible to say, if we want to make big, large-scale social changes, we need kind of blunt instruments in terms of very large-scale interventions. That does not allow us to necessarily move forward scientifically. And there are a tremendous number of very exciting approaches that are being developed. Some of them involve cognitive training. Others involve, we're very active in looking at video coaching specific microsocial moments of interaction that seem to be involved in serve and return, and that we can show caregivers what they're already doing correctly with a high level of precision. We think those kinds of approaches, which have much greater precision, are going to allow us to be much more clear in our experimental studies of whether we're actually impacting the specific systems that we say we want to target. And it's only by doing that kind of precise study and then moving that into communities, which is work that one of the things that the Harvard Center has been very active in supporting, that I think we have potential to make the biggest impact. So I think that the future is really bright for this kind of work, but I also think that it's certainly not enough to kind of rest on our laurels and say, well, we've learned about HPA axis and we've learned about evidence-based interventions, and so we've arrived. We've clearly only just begun, but I think that we have great potential to move forward, and presumably what we're going to hear about for the rest of today will help us take another step in that direction. Thank you.